Welcome to New Possibilities. I speak truth to power without fear. So today I'm going to talk about Georgia being sued for suppressing African American voters. But before I do that, I'm going to wait until a couple of people tune in. And also, I just want to let you all know about my Facebook page. Now, I rarely promote my Facebook page, and I want to change that. I want to get more people to like my Facebook page. So I'm going to share it with you all now. And I guess I'll post a link in the chat so that people can just like it, like that page. I just need to promote it more because on that page, I often post about, the stories that I end up talking about. Like I post stories that I end up talking about on my YouTube channel. So here's my Facebook page, and I'm going to share the link to it in the chat so that people could like the page. As you see here, I talk about like different things. I mainly just post articles about stories that I end up talking about. And I also post things that I don't talk about on my channel. And I plan to do more on my Facebook page. I plan to do live streams on Facebook. So I want y'all to like my Facebook page. I'm going to have exclusive content on this Facebook page. So you all like the page. I truly appreciate your support. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen for a second. So again, I encourage y'all to like my Facebook page. I'll post the link in the chat room right now, so you can just go ahead and like it right now. Because yeah, often on there, I post about stories ahead of time before I actually talk about them here on YouTube. And also, it's a place where people can communicate with me. So if you have certain subjects that you think I should talk about, you all can message me on Facebook, and I'll be happy to consider those stories to discuss. A lot of people communicate with me on Facebook, directly. Like, for instance, if they see a video and they have certain questions about a video that I posted on YouTube, they'll actually message me on Facebook. And I get those messages more directly. Like on YouTube, I get so many comments to a lot of my videos. Often people can cut through like the chatter and the noise by messaging me directly on Facebook. So I encourage you all to like my Facebook page. So now let's get into the story that we're here to talk about. This should be a brief hangout. It shouldn't last long. So let me share my page again so you all could see this article. So several civil rights groups have sued the state of Georgia for suppressing African American voters. Now, in Georgia, they have this exact match protocol, which requires voter registration applications to exactly match the state's Department of Motor Vehicle records and the Social Security Administration's records. So for instance, if someone fills out a voter registration application and there's something that's very slightly different from the records that are with the Department of Motor Vehicles, they will consider that voter registration application not to be a match, and they will place that on hold. And that's what has happened in Georgia. 53,000 voter registration applications are on hold because of this exact match rule. So for instance, if there's a hyphen on the voter registration application and there's no hyphen in the record with the Department of Motor Vehicles or the Social Security Administration, then that will be considered not a match, and that application will be on hold. And this is something that frequently happens. Any kind of slight variation. For instance, someone could have as this article points out, they could have Tom on their voter registration application, but the records with the Department of Motor Vehicles has their name as Thomas, fully spelled out. Things like that can result of somebody's application for voter registration being held and them not actually being able to cast a vote. So here you have 53,000 voter registration applications that are on hold. And according to the Associated Press, the AP, they did an analysis and they found that 70% of the applications that are on hold are African Americans, even though African Americans only make up 32% of the state's population. So that makes it abundantly clear that this whole policy has a disproportionate impact on the Black community. And for that reason, you had these civil rights groups sue the state of Georgia, alleging that this policy violates the Voter Rights Act, it violates the 14th Amendment and the Voter Registration Act. So that lawsuit is going forward in the U.S. District Court in Atlanta, and I hope that they prevail, because this situation not only involves a state suppressing African-American voters, you have the Secretary of State who's in charge of this process. He's actually conflicted because this man is running for governor of the state of Georgia, while at the same time he's overseeing the election process. So this man obviously has a conflict of interest, and he's using his position as Secretary of State to benefit him in this election, to undermine the election, and to block or to suppress many African-American voters in this key election. This is a very close election, as many people have pointed out. You have an African-American woman running for governor against this Secretary of State, and his name is Brian Kemp. It's a very close race. And this woman is the first African-American woman who has been nominated for governor of in a major party. And she has a very real shot of becoming the first African-American woman governor. So this is huge. This is very significant. And this woman is dependent, obviously, on African-American voter turnout. African-Americans actually casting their ballot. And in a close election such as this, 53,000 votes is very significant. That could make the difference in this election. And this guy, Secretary of State Kemp, understands this. And that's why he's using this office to hold back these voter registrations, to suppress African-American voters. Now, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. I'm going to look at your comments, and then I'm going to proceed with my commentary. Again, I want to thank you all for tuning in. I truly appreciate it. Shout out to Garage Autonomous. Shout out to Elaine Lloyd. Yeah, this is something that needs to be discussed, but unfortunately, you won't see too many of these YouTube personalities, some of these personalities talking about this stuff. They would rather talk about issues that are either irrelevant, like celebrity gossip type stuff, which is, that's cool. It has its place. I'm not going to completely hate on that stuff, because I do talk about celebrities every now and then. But it's like they are more concerned about that kind of stuff than things that actually matter. And some of these people that profess to be about Black empowerment, these people that talk all this pro-Black rhetoric, a lot of these are the same people that de-emphasize the need for Black people to participate in the electoral policy, process. These are the same people that de-emphasize the importance of voting. These are the people that actually have don't vote campaigns and tell you and me that federal elections don't matter. And some of these people even go so far as to say no elections matter. These are the people that we're relying on. They're not going to be talking about this voter suppression issue. You know, they would rather be concerned with these little kind of minor little incidents that happen every now and then instead of something like this that affects 53,000 people. 70% of those people are African American, being denied their right to vote. And this conflict of interest issue is very key. I mean, here you have a man who's overseeing an election that he's participating in. Just imagine someone judging, for instance, a tennis match that they are participating in, or being the referee in a boxing match that they're actually boxing in, or being a referee in a football match that they're actually playing in. That doesn't make any kind of sense. And they should have some kind of policy in place that requires the Secretary of State to step down in these certain kinds of situations. And there should be public pressure to have this man resign from his position while this election is going on. Because there is no way that you can be fair as the Secretary of State in a situation where you are actually running for governor. You can't be trusted. And the people are not going to have confidence in the results of this election if you are overseeing the election in which you're running. This is a very tight election. And I'm sure that if this guy, Brian Kemp, wins, many people are going to rightfully question the results. They're going to question it because you had this man rigging the system so that he can come out on top, rigging the system so that all those black people that have put their energy and focus into voting and actually trying to make a difference in their state had their voices silent. That's going to cause people to lose hope. That's going to cause people to lose faith. And something has to be done about this situation. And, the thing is, this is blatant racism. Again, here you have 53,000 voters being put on hold, and 70% of them are black. That is not a coincidence. That is by design. That is by design without a doubt. You can't tell me that that's some kind of coincidence where you have an African-American woman running for governor, and then you have most of these 53,000 voters being African American, being suppressed, having their applications put on hold. I mean, this is blatant racism. And the thing is, this is nothing but voter suppression. Voter suppression has evolved over the years. There was a time when they used outright terrorism to prevent African Americans from voting. The Klan would lynch people for trying to vote. Racist organizations like the White Citizens Council would use terror tactics to prevent black people from voting. They used to have the police brutalize black people. We all know what happened in Selma when they were trying to march for voting rights, and they were beaten severely, and dogs were sent to attack them, to rip their flesh, and they were hit with tear gas and all that kind of stuff, simply for trying to exercise their right to vote, simply for trying to exercise their rights as citizens in this country. They were subjected to that kind of brutality. That's what they used to do back then. Just like when they killed those civil rights workers who were trying to register black people to vote in Mississippi. 3 civil rights workers end up missing. 2 of them white civil rights workers and 1 of them black. We saw what happened to Medgar Evers, shot in front of his house. And one of the key things that brother was trying to do was register black people to vote, give black people the right to vote, empower the black community. For that brother was killed. That's what they used to do back then. Use outright terrorism against us. They had literacy tests back then where they would, require black people to take these tests in order to be able to vote. And these were tests designed for black people to fail so that black people would not have the right to vote. They had poll taxes. They had ridiculous things where they would require black people to guess how many bubbles are on a bar of soap, things like that, in order to prevent black people from voting. All kinds of oppressive tactics were used to prevent black people from voting. And now these people have merely evolved in their tactics of suppressing the Black voters. And, this reminds me of the question that I raised in one of my videos. If our vote didn't matter, these people wouldn't go through all this trouble to suppress our vote. But today, the tactics have become more covert. The tactics have become more sophisticated. Like one of the key things that they did was they took this case to the Supreme Court, the Shelby County versus Holder case, all the way to the Supreme Court in order to gut the Voting Rights Act. They stripped it of a key provision that was designed to protect African American voters and other so-called minority voters in this country. They gutted that act. There was a provision in there that required that certain jurisdictions with a long history of discriminating against African American voters, those jurisdictions were required to pre-clear any kind of changes in their voting laws in order to ensure that those changes were not discriminatory against African Americans and other groups of people. So it protected certain communities from discrimination before it could even happen. They had to get clearance from federal courts and or the Justice Department before they could implement any kind of changes. But now, after that Shelby County versus Holder decision, these jurisdictions that had a long history of discriminating against African American voters, they have now been unleashed on the Black community, and now they have imposed all kinds of voter suppression tactics and laws to make it more difficult for African Americans to vote. Again, if our vote didn't matter, they wouldn't do this. So now we don't have the shield that we used to have in the Voting Rights Act under Section 4 and 5. Now we have to rely on Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act to protect ourselves. So their tactics are more covert. They basically said, well, certain provisions of the Voting Rights Act are obsolete now. Those types of things no longer occur, so you no longer need that protection. You need to have a new formula for deciding which states are subjected to pre-clearance. So now as a result of that, you have more voter suppression tactics. They actually use the laws in a covert way to suppress African American voters in the name of voter so-called integrity, in the name of fighting so-called voter fraud. These people are using all kinds of tactics to suppress African American voters, like what happened in North Carolina, where you had the state legislature impose one of the most restrictive and discriminatory voter suppression laws in the country, which heightened the requirements for voter ID, got rid of same-day voter registration, restricted early voting, got rid of out-of-precinct voting. All these measures that they took that were designed to suppress African American voters, to make it more difficult for African American voters. That's something that has to be taken into account, man. They are more covert. So in the name of protecting the integrity of the elections, they are using these covert tactics to actually suppress African American voters. And you have one of the most conservative courts in the country, the Fourth Circuit, find that law in North Carolina was targeting the Black community with almost surgical precision. They knew ahead of time that voter ID requirements would disproportionately impact Black communities, but they went ahead with it anyway. They knew ahead of time that African Americans used early voting more than other groups of people in North Carolina, but they went ahead with it anyway. They knew that African Americans were more likely to use same-day voter registration than other groups of people, but yet they went ahead with it anyway. They knew that African Americans often in certain situations in North Carolina would have to vote out of precinct, but they went ahead to eliminate out of precinct voting. They knew what they were doing. They were suppressing African American voters under the guise of protecting the integrity of the election. That's how they are more covert today. They're no longer using poll taxes and literacy tests and outright terrorism. Instead, they are using other tactics in the name of voter integrity that are designed to suppress African American voters. And you also have situations where they use misleading flyers, for instance, in Black communities, telling Black people that Democrats vote on Wednesday and Republicans vote on Tuesdays and stuff like that, designed to have African Americans miss the opportunity to vote. That's what they do. Provide misinformation to mislead our people so that our people end up not turning out for these elections. There have been situations, for instance, in Cincinnati, Ohio, where they posted billboards in Black communities saying that voter fraud is a crime. You could face 3.5 years or $10,000 fine. These tactics were designed to scare Black people, to intimidate Black people, to make Black people not go out to vote. And then you've had situations, for instance, where flyers have gone to Black communities telling people that if you owe child support, if you have any ticket violations, if you haven't submitted credit reports, that you can not vote. They would issue these false statements to confuse Black voters, to deceive Black voters so that they could suppress the African American voters. And then you have situations where polling places are closed in Black communities, close, like they had a proposal, for instance, in Randolph County, Georgia, to close 7 out of 9 polling places, thereby making it more difficult for African Americans to cast their votes. And thankfully, because of the work of civil rights organizations, they were able to counter that proposal and have that proposal rejected. So there are new tactics that these people are using. They are purging voters, and they're doing exactly what's happening here in, well, not here, but in Georgia, where they're trying to have this exact match protocol, and they're using that to hold up 53,000 voter registration applications. Again, voter suppression continues. It has only evolved. And again, this is just another reminder of how important the vote is, because if the vote didn't matter, these people would not be going out of their way to suppress African American voters. They don't want us to have political power, period. And unfortunately, some of these talking heads on here, they are helping these people suppress African American voters by telling you that your vote is not significant. And I'm just going to name the names. You got people like Boyce Watkins who got on here and constantly told you that elections don't really matter that much. Constantly did this in the lead up to the presidential election. And then after the fact, when he's criticized for this, he wants to disown his own statements. Then you got that fool Tariq Nasheed on here telling you to participate in some don't vote campaign. So it's like you don't even need these white racists to suppress Black voters when you had these fake pro-Black activists on here telling you not to vote. Actually leading a don't vote campaign. I mean, how idiotic is that, man? After our people sacrifice so much for the right to vote, you got a supposed Black activist on here, and he's not even an activist, on here telling you and me not to vote. But that's what passes for, consciousness on here. You got people like Cynthia G telling you not to vote. You got people like Robert Perkins on here telling you not to vote. And the list goes on and on and on. You got these people constantly de-emphasizing the need to participate in the political process, even though politics and the laws that these politicians pass impact every aspect of our lives. You got these people on here telling you and me that our vote doesn't matter. And you got people actually parroting this nonsense, parroting the idea that only local elections matter and federal elections don't, even though federal laws are passed every day that affect our lives. The civil rights laws that I mentioned before that are the basis for this lawsuit are laws that protect our rights. and they were passed on the federal level. The Voting Rights Act was passed on the federal level. The Civil Rights Act was passed on the federal level. The Fair Housing Act was passed on the federal level. The Help America Vote Act was passed on the federal level. So these people telling you that you don't need to be worried about federal elections, they don't know what the hell they're talking about. They are foolish. They are misguided. And at worst, in a worst case scenario, they are collaborators with these people that want to suppress our vote. They're collaborators. They are like agents when you look at it. You know, these people want to say that voting doesn't matter. Our ancestors and our elders understood that the vote matters. And that's what I'm going to close out on in this video. I'm just going to explain why the vote matters. They realized that it was the politicians that made the laws that subjected Black people to Jim Crow segregation. There were white supremacist lawmakers that passed those laws that said, well, you're going to have separate schools and you're going to have facilities that say no coloreds allowed, or Black people have to go to the back of the restaurant, or they have to sit in the balcony at the movie theater. They have to sit at the back of the bus. All those were laws. Those were laws imposed. It was a legal system that allowed those people to get away with lynching Black people. And our ancestors and elders knew that you had to have laws in place in order to hold these people accountable. Now, obviously, passing the law alone will not solve the problem. You have to have those laws enforced and everything, but a law is very important. It's important to have laws on the books to protect our rights. So they knew that as long as Black people couldn't vote, then they would have no impact on public policy. They knew that as long as Black people couldn't vote in the South, you would still have segregationists in power imposing oppressive laws against Black people. So they realized how important the vote was, and that's why they were willing to sacrifice everything so that Black people could vote, because they knew that with the vote came some semblance of freedom. They realized this. The reason why it matters for us to vote is because our votes impact every single aspect of our lives. Every single aspect, on the federal level, the state level, and the local level. It is public policy that decides what kind of funding our schools receive, what kind of quality education our children receive. Government policy determines that. Government policy determines how we're going to address, problems such as crime in our community, the opioid crisis, the heroin crisis, the crack epidemic, the violence that plagues our communities. Public policy decisions impact all of that. Public policy decisions impact how the police carry out their duty, whether or not we are subjected to police brutality. Public policy determines that. It is the mayor that appoints the chief of police in many states. A chief of police that can set the tone and set the policies in a police department. So it matters on that basic level. Our elections matter on the local level as well, because we elect the district attorneys who have the power to decide whether or not to bring cases against police officers that brutalize us. The district attorneys have certain influence over how they're going to prosecute criminal cases. They have the power to decide whether or not to prosecute nonviolent drug offenders, as opposed to focusing on offenders that are committing violence in our community. They have that kind of power and that kind of influence, and that's why elections matter. They have the power, in terms of elections. Elected officials determine how resources are allocated, how tax dollars are allocated, from basic things such as trash cleanup, such as the funding for our schools, the funding for our roads and streets. All of those things are determined on the political level. And that's why we need to have some kind of role in deciding who our leaders are. And the only way you can do that is through elections. Now, I'm not saying that voting alone is all we need. Obviously, we still need a protest movement. Obviously, we need to not only vote, but we need to hold elected officials accountable for their actions. We need to financially support certain candidates for office. And then also, like, elections impact things like the environment, like what kind of environmental regulations we're going to have. If we don't have environmental regulations, then all of our lives are in jeopardy. With the erosion of the environment, with pollution, that jeopardizes human life, period, for all of us. So it matters who's elected. It matters how our tax dollars are allocated. Whether or not our tax dollars go to schools versus tax dollars going to prisons. We have the power to determine that through electing officials that adhere to our agenda. Also, basic things such as a woman's right to choose, gun control, all of those issues matter. And all those issues are a part of voting. It's important for us to have our voices heard. And it's people like this Brian Kemp who don't want our voices heard. They understand the impact of the Black vote. And that's why they do everything in their power to suppress our vote so that we won't have any kind of impact on public policy. So they will be the ones making all the decisions. Anybody that questions whether or not elections matter, all they have to do is look at the differences between the Obama administration and the Trump administration. And obviously the Obama administration was not perfect. Everyone can criticize any administration, but when you compare the two, the Trump administration and the Obama administration, it's a night and day difference in terms of how they deal with police brutality, how they deal with healthcare, how they deal with the issue of affirmative action, how they deal with voting rights, on all those major important issues, the appointments to the Supreme Court, those things matter. And it's just sad that you have buffoons on here who don't even realize how important this is. People downplaying the significance of who's on the Supreme Court, downplaying the significance of the vote. It's just a shame, man. It's time for us to wake up and, it's down to the wire. I mean, who we elect in these upcoming elections is going to have an impact on the public policies that we see. We have the potential to influence the House of Representatives and the Senate by voting in the right people to counter Trump and his agenda, to push back against these appointments of these right-wing judges on the federal bench. Donald Trump is in a position of power. He is appointing these right-wing judges not only on the Supreme Court, but on the lower federal level. And these people are going to have the impact and the influence over key decisions involving our civil liberties and our civil rights. These elections matter, and it's time for our people to wake up. If you are not registered to vote, you need to register to vote today. You need to find out about your politicians that are running for office. Find out their positions and find out which politician is most beneficial to our community. Do you even know who your city council person is? Do you even know who your senator is? Do you even really know who your mayor is or who your district attorney is? If you don't know those things, you need to find them out today. I mean, it's funny how you can go into any barbershop in the Black community and you will have all these guys in a barbershop. They can tell you everything about every football player on every team. They can tell you everything about every basketball player on every team. They can tell you everything about just about every major boxer, but they can't tell you anything about who runs the politics in the community. They can't tell you anything about what kind of policies their senator supports or what kind of policies their governor supports. They can't even tell you who their state councilman is. But yet they can tell you all kinds of things about things that don't matter in the big scheme of things. They're more concerned with a man throwing a ball through a hoop than they are concerned about the policymakers. They're more concerned with a man tackling somebody on a football field than they are concerned about the policies that are destroying Black communities. So it's time for us to wake up. It's time for us to get up, and it's time for us to vote in these elections. And we need to not only vote, but we need to hold these elected officials accountable. So with that, I'm going to look at your comments, see what you all are saying. I want to thank y'all for tuning in. I don't like making these hangouts too long. I like to get to the point. So I'm going to go to your comments now. So Freeman says they're from Georgia, 18 years old, and got lucky. Yeah, so if you're in Georgia, you should check your voter registration status. And I think that all of you, everybody that's listening to this, needs to go online and check your voter registration status to make sure that you are registered to vote. Because I know that here in Maryland, the deadline for voter registration is Tuesday or something, if I'm not mistaken. I think it's October 16th. Is coming up very soon. So, and I know that the same is true in many other states around the country. They may have already, missed the deadline to register in other states. So you need to find out what's the deadline for voter registration and register immediately so that you can have some kind of impact on this election. Yeah, I mean, that's a good point, Elaine Lloyd. Like if, as I was saying, like if elections aren't important, they wouldn't go through this trouble of suppressing African American voters. They wouldn't, as Elaine points out, they wouldn't have had a all-white primary to prevent African Americans from voting. They wouldn't have had all these measures. Yeah, so Garage Autonomous mentioned that our enemies use legislation, economics, rules, and regulations to destroy our community. They don't need lynching and burning crosses anymore. That's right, they don't, especially when we are absent from the process. I mean, you all have heard that expression. If you're not at the table, then you're on the menu. And if we're not participating in the electoral process, if we're not participating in the legislative process, if we're not judges in these courts, then we are not at the table, and we are on the menu when it comes to these issues such as allocation of resources, when it comes to taxes and all that kind of stuff, when it comes to issues like healthcare. If the corporations are at the table and the people are at the table, guess who's going to win? The corporations. If white people are at the table and Black people aren't at the table, we're not participating, then we Black people are going to be on the menu. So, so Minor said all Black people do is vote Democrat. Sadly, they don't do shit for Black people. But abortion, mass incarceration, drugs, and helping illegals and LGBT. I mean, I think that that's an exaggeration. I think that obviously we should have more options besides the Democrats. As you all know, I voted independent in the presidential election. I do vote for Democrats over Republicans for obvious reasons. There's no comparison between the two parties. The Republicans are openly hostile to affirmative action. They're openly hostile to voting rights. They are the ones who gutted the Voting Rights Act. Republican appointed judges are the ones who voted in support of gutting the Voting Rights Act. They are openly hostile when it comes to law and order. They support, like you got Donald Trump on record saying that he supports racial profiling. Donald Trump on record calling for stop and frisk in Black communities, even though that was found to be unconstitutional in New York. It was found to be discriminatory in New York. But this man doubles down and presses forward with stop and frisk. That's the Republican Party. And, this idea that, it's like we're taking on these talking points of the right, this anti-immigrant nonsense, which is nothing but racism, which is nothing but, white supremacy. These people fear the browning of America. That's why they are hostile to quote unquote illegal immigrants. This nation is a nation of immigrants. Many of these Congress people that are all gung-ho for this anti-immigrant nonsense are the same people who are descendants of immigrants or immigrants themselves. You got these right-wing people who are actually immigrants, trying to impose laws against immigrants. See, their thing and their position against immigrants is primarily focused on immigrants of color. But when it comes to these white immigrants, they don't have any problem with that. Those Republicans remind you of that every day. You got a president that called Mexicans rapists and criminals. You got a president who refers to African countries as shithole countries. That's your Republican Party. When you see Trump and his antics, it was the Republicans that voted him into power. Don't ever forget that. So, this idea that the Republicans and the Democrats are one and the same is nonsense. This idea that the Democrats have done nothing for Black people is wrong. It's just outright false when you just look at the Obama administration. Obviously the Democrats don't do everything. They don't do enough, but they do much more than the Republicans do. The Democrats have done much more in recent history. We're not talking about ancient history. We're talking about recent history. All you have to do is look at the Obama administration. For instance, the Obama administration fought to protect our voting rights. In the Shelby County versus Holder case, in the Texas voter ID case, the Obama administration fought to protect affirmative action. In the case of Fisher versus the University of Texas. And despite all this rhetoric, I was listening to this tape of this guy, Sergeant Willie Pete, and I hardly ever listened to him, but somebody was playing one of his videos, clips of it, one of his videos where he was basically saying, well, the Supreme Court doesn't matter and this and that. I mean, it's just outright outrageous, man. It's outrageous and ridiculous. The Supreme Court decides all these issues that matter when it comes to Black people. And, so I just want to go back. So you got the appointment of the Supreme Court, in terms of what kind of judges they appoint. And then also you look at the Obama administration and how they entered those consent decrees with all those police departments to end discriminatory practices. That's something that's beneficial to the Black community. You look at the Affordable Care Act, which helped ensure many people did not have health insurance. Many people who were barred from health insurance because of pre-existing conditions. Because of the Affordable Care Act, many of those people who are disproportionately Black have health care. The Obama administration put forth the Brothers Keepers program. So they have done many things that have been beneficial to the Black community. And you have this Trump administration, on the other hand, who is hostile to all those important issues that matter to our community. So I reject the notion that Democrats haven't done anything when it comes to the Black community. Of course, they should do much more. When you look at these justice appointments and who's appointed, I mean, that's one of the key things that matters. We can see the night and day difference between those two parties. When we look at just the number of African-American elected officials that have been nominated within those parties, we can see a night and day difference. In terms of the Democrats nominating an African-American for president, in terms of the Democrats nominating African-Americans for governor. So, I mean, there's a difference between the two. So let me continue on. Yeah, I mean, I agree that there are problems with Democrats and Republicans. As you all know, like I've done videos about why I didn't support Hillary Clinton, spoke out about what the Clintons did with respect to the crime bill and so-called welfare reform. I talked about that kind of stuff. So I'm not saying that the Democrats are saints or, they're without fault and they're perfect and this and that. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that when you compare the two, there's a huge difference. When you compare the two, there's a difference between the Democrats and the Republicans. Of course, like my politics are further to the left of many things that the Democrats do. For instance, with the Affordable Care Act, while that was a positive measure in the right direction, it didn't go nearly far enough. I think that we need to have a single payer system here in America. But the Democrats are if you're going to say that they're evil, they're the lesser of two evils. They are a better alternative than the Republican Party. The Republican Party is trying to get rid of many programs that benefit African Americans. It's the Republican Party that's trying to take away Section 8 from poor families, that provides poor families with housing. Many of those poor families are African Americans. It's the Republicans that are trying to take food out of the mouths of poor people by getting rid of food stamps. It's the Republicans that want to get rid of Head Start programs in Black communities. It's the Republicans that want to cut back on student aid for struggling African American students that are trying to go to college. So there is a difference between these parties. And I'm so sick of people basically trying to make it seem like they're one and the same when they are not. Now, there are some similarities, like when you look at foreign policy, when you look at how they deal with corporations, but let's not pretend that these two parties are one and the same when they are not. See, I think that we need to be more informed about the issues, and we need to get out of this emotionalism when it comes to politics and focus on being rational, focus on weighing pros and cons and drawing comparison between the actual candidates that are up for election. So yeah, I just had to say that, man. I just had to make that point. Again, I'm not going to keep y'all too long on here, but I do want to go through your comments. So Freeman said that we all know that Stacey Abrams will win, though. I don't know. I mean, it's a real close election, man. I don't know what's going to happen. I hope that she wins, but you never know, especially when you got this Secretary of State playing games with voters and, trying to suppress African American voters. You never know what's going to happen, but we'll see. I hope the sister wins in Georgia. I hope the brother in Florida wins, and I hope the brother Ben Jealous here in Maryland wins. And we have to support these African American candidates that are running on progressive agendas, not just support them because they're African American, but support them because they offer a more progressive agenda than their opponents do. That's why we need to support them. Yeah, so Garage Autonomous said, I may not vote Democrat or Republican, but electoral politics is a tool like all other tools for us to consider for change and empowerment. Exactly. That's the thing. It's one of many tools. And I think that we need to use any means necessary to advance our interests as a people. And electoral politics is one of those means. And this is something that Brother Malcolm X talked about in his famous ballot or the bullet speech. I encourage you all to look that speech up here on YouTube. If I have time, I'll post a link to that video in the description box so that people can check it out. I mean, I'm sure that many of you have heard that speech by now, but it's a very important speech that emphasizes the importance of the vote. And you don't have to vote for Democrats or Republicans. I mean, there are other candidates that are running for office. I mean, there are third party candidates. You have Green Party candidates, you have socialists, you have people from other types of parties, libertarians. So you have a wide choice of candidates to vote for. Whether or not they win is another thing, but you should exercise your right to vote. A vote can be a form of protest. A vote is a way that you voice your priorities. You make yourself heard. Um, so yeah, that's a good point. I mean, but for me, like in many elections, like I do tend to vote for Democrats, but I also have voted for independents. As you all know, again, I voted for the Green Party candidate during the presidential election. And sometimes as a protest, I voted for like a Republican candidate, like in situations where, a Democrat takes the vote for granted. Um, so yeah, I think that we should be open-minded when it comes to politics, but we also need to be practical as well. We also need to be considerate of like the consequences of elections and not just make some decision based on our emotions. All right, so yeah, so Miner said our vote definitely matters. Um, Freeman said we should all vote. So Miner said, please stop the political correctness. I guess that's what you're saying. Yeah, Freeman said, if you don't vote, shut the fuck up, basically. And I agree, man. If you're not voting, then you don't have any right to get on here whining and crying about Donald Trump being a white supremacist. You got all these people on here that told you that elections don't matter, but then they're doing videos about how horrible Trump is. I mean, when people do that, they don't have any credibility in my eyes. The best way to speak is not just by, talking on YouTube. You can speak with your ballot. You can speak by actually participating in demonstrations against injustice. I'm not aware of any of these activists, on quote unquote activists on here, actually participating in activism, actually calling on anybody to participate in any kind of protest or to even voice support for a demonstration. I'm not aware of these people doing this. If I'm wrong, prove me wrong. Cite me an example of a Boyce Watkins calling on his hundreds of thousands of supporters to participate in some march or rally. Point to me an example of a Umar Johnson doing the same thing, or Cynthia G, or Robert Perkins, or any of these people. Yeah, that's right. Ill Wills, like if your name was slightly different on your registration form in Georgia, they're gonna put your voter registration application on hold. Like for instance, if your last name is hyphenated on your Department of Motor Vehicles record, but it's not hyphenated in your application, then they'll put your application on hold, thereby making it possible that you may not even vote. You may not even be able to vote in the election. This is the kind of shenanigans that this guy is doing over there in Georgia. And I'm glad that these civil rights groups uh, actually brought a lawsuit to stop this injustice, man. See, unlike the people here on YouTube that just talk, they actually put together a lawsuit to stop this action. And that's positive, man. I support that. Yeah, you're right, Covina, man. They are a part of the new Jim Crow, man. It's just crazy that you got quote unquote black activists encouraging black people not to vote. I mean, they're analogous to the Klan telling black people not to vote. They're analogous to those police that brutalized black people so that black people wouldn't vote. No different, man. They're acting like agents for the system of oppression, man, by encouraging us not to vote. Just bear with me a second. Yeah, it is deeper than just voting. It's more than just registering to vote and actually voting. That's not the end of the process. We also need accountability. We also need to encourage people to run for office, and not just encourage them with our words, but encourage them with our dollars so that we can influence the process. Um, Also, we need to put forth our own legislation and encourage and demand our elected officials to implement that legislation. And you do have civil rights groups to do that, but we need more of that. So it's more than just about voting. Yeah, I mean, I think that the reparations issue is very important. And, we should raise that issue with any political candidate that comes before us, any candidate that's running for Congress, any candidate that's running for the Senate, any candidate that's running for the president. They need to be asked about reparations. So that's a valid point. And that's one of the things that I differ with Bernie Sanders on, the issue of reparations. That's an issue that's very important. If Native Americans can be compensated, we can be compensated. If Jews can be compensated, then we can be compensated. Yeah, we do need more organization. I agree with that. I mean, you do have some groups that are organizing, but you need more of that. And that organization needs to be tied to electoral politics. It needs to be tied to protests. It needs to be multifaceted, multidimensional. And again, like Garage Autonomous said, voting is just one tool. I mean, you have so many other tactics that can be used. You have voting, you have protests, you have lobbying, you have, using our voices on social media as a way to influence things. So we need to use every means available to us to demonstrate. Boycotting is a form of protest. We need to use all these means to affect change. It's like if you're in a war and you got all these weapons in your arsenal and you say, well, I'm not going to use the AK. I'm just going to use these guns. You need to use all that stuff. You need to use every single weapon that's available to you instead of like leaving key weapons at the table when those weapons can be tools for your liberation. And Blue, Black, Purple said Republicans know that voting matters. That's why they try to suppress the black vote. Exactly. Exactly, man. If our vote did not matter, they wouldn't waste their time suppressing our vote. They would be happy that we would vote. They wouldn't care less if we vote, if our vote didn't matter. They wouldn't be doing what this guy, Brian Kemp, is doing in Georgia, suppressing 53,000 votes. And also, I was listening to this broadcast or this little video clip from um, one of these MSNBC shows, and they were talking about how the same guy canceled 600,000 voter registrations in a prior election. If votes didn't matter, they wouldn't go through the trouble canceling all those registrations. If votes didn't matter, they wouldn't have gone to the Supreme Court to gut the Voting Rights Act. So these people understand that voting matters. It's just, some of our people are so ignorant that they don't understand the importance of voting. Even after our ancestors fought and died for that right, you got people on here defending, the idea that we should not vote. You know, they suppress votes in all kinds of ways with felon disenfranchisement laws and stuff like that. You know, laws that were designed to disenfranchise Black people, but yet and still you got people still on here talking about voting doesn't matter. What's wrong with these people, man? All right. Shout out to LA. I don't know why you're against voting. I mean, how does sitting at home on election day benefit Black people? What is your proposal to do anything to improve our condition as a people, man? That's what I want to know. I mean, if you're not for voting, what alternatives do you have to offer? I agree. If you don't vote, then you can't complain, man. I agree with that point, Michelle Taylor. Yeah, so I want to thank y'all for tuning in. I really appreciate it. Again, if you're not subscribed to this channel, subscribe, get the likes up, support your man, New Possibilities, share my videos. If you're watching this on a playback, tell me what you think. Do you think that voting matters? If not, why not? If so, why so? Um, Also, what do you think about what's happening in Georgia, where they're suppressing like 53,000 people that have registered to vote? So I'm really interested in hearing your opinions. Again, I want to thank you all for tuning in. Let's see, LA's left one comment that I want to get to before I close out. The system needs to be destroyed and rebuilt. We cannot come up in the system that counters everything we do, and they always move the goalpost. I mean, how do you propose to destroy the system, man? I mean, it's like people, that rhetoric sounds good. You know, it riles people up. It gets your emotions going and blood flowing and stuff like that. But it's impractical. There's no real plan to destroy the system. I mean, there's no revolution happening anytime soon. You can't even organize people to create reforms, and you're talking about, you know, revolutionary rhetoric. Um, you know, I understand that, you know, the system needs to be fundamentally changed. I don't disagree with that point at all. But one way that you can implement change is through the legislative process. Some change can happen through the legislative process. All we have to do is look at our situation today and compare it to the situation of our grandparents and our parents who lived under Jim Crow. Because of laws, we no longer live under Jim Crow. That's a very practical example of how laws can make a fundamental difference. You know, there was a time when Black people couldn't even vote in this country, and now we have many elected officials that have influence and power in this country. Are we where we need to be? Of course not, but we have come a long way from where we were. I mean, in terms of the number of Black people who are educated, in terms of the number of Black elected officials, in terms of Black economic influence, we have come a long way from where we were. Today, you have Black leaders of major corporations. You have many Black entrepreneurs. We are much better off today than we were back during the Jim Crow era. I mean, despite all this ridiculous rhetoric that romanticizes the Jim Crow era, you know, we're better off. We don't have to sit in the back of the bus anymore. We don't have to see signs that say no coloreds allowed, no dogs and no coloreds allowed signs. We don't have to see that today. And that's a result of using the system, whether it's the legislative process or the judicial system or through the political system. Through those things, we have been able to create some kind of change in this society. For us to pretend like we're in the same situation is just an exaggeration, and it ignores reality. We are not in the same situation as our grandparents were. We are not in the same situation as our ancestors were, who were brought here in chains and shackles and who were bought and sold and beaten and raped. We're not in the same situation as that. So let's not pretend like there has been no progress. There has been substantial progress, and we need more progress. And one way that you can change things is through the legislative process. Now, I think that ultimately you need even more fundamental change, but you can start by using the legislative process to the fullest extent possible. So with that, I'm going to say peace and blessings. I could go on all day with this back and forth with LA, but you all understand the point. I mean, you understand that if our vote didn't matter, this guy, Brian Kemp, would not be trying to hold on to 53,000 voter registration applications. So with that, I'm going to say peace and blessings, and I hope you all have a great weekend.